the height of World War II, the Allies had their backs against the wall. 800,000 tons of American supply ships and hundreds of lives were lost to the German U-boats in July of 1942 alone. The key to security, victory, and freedom lay in the air. Henry J. Kaiser, famed industrialist and shipbuilder, boldly proposed the construction of a fleet of giant flying boats to solve the problem. Kaiser was convinced the flying ships could transport combat troops, supplies, and military equipment over the German menace in the Atlantic. Impossible, scoffed the critics. It's pure folly. Nothing that big will ever get off the ground. Kaiser was not discouraged, however, for he knew of one person who could get his scheme airborne, who had the talent, intellect, and determination to get the job done. Who was this man? Howard Hughes, a wealthy entrepreneur, movie producer, brilliant aviation designer, and record-holding pilot. A man to be reckoned with, a man who excelled at making the impossible possible. The shipbuilder and aviator combined forces to create the Kaiser-Hughes Corporation, and soon they landed an $18 million government contract to design and construct 3 prototype flying boats. Since no hangar was large enough to accommodate this mammoth undertaking, Hughes ordered a special hangar built at the Hughes Aircraft Plant in Culver City, California. As construction of the hangar began, a skilled team of engineers immediately set to work on designing the plane. A twin-hull aircraft was considered initially, but later abandoned in favor of a single-hull flying boat, capable of carrying 750 troops. The final design called for 8 3,000 horsepower engines and a wingspan of 320 feet, 20 feet longer than a football field. It was dubbed the HK-1, standing for the Hughes Kaiser Design No. 1. Howard Hughes personally directed the design team during every phase of production. They tested models to ensure that the flying boat would be both aero and hydrodynamic. The renowned test pilot Hughes also flew other seaplanes as part of the testing program. Due to wartime shortages, the government contract stipulated that metal could not be used to construct the flying boat. Undaunted, Hughes found an alternative and another brilliant solution to a seemingly insurmountable problem. He would build the airplane with wood, choice birch, light, strong, sturdy, and resilient. Workers laminated the birch using a bonding process called Duramold. This gave the flying boat a glassy, hard sheen to reduce drag. The government contract also prohibited the hiring of skilled laborers from other aircraft companies. There could be no drain on the war effort diverted to building of the flying boat. So Hughes recruited young engineers and mechanics from across the country and trained them on the job. Several delays occurred due to the immense complexity of the flying boat's innovative construction and design. Hughes complicated the process further by personally managing and approving every detail. In mid-1944, Henry Kaiser withdrew from the project, and the giant seaplane that began as the HK-1 was renamed the H-4, standing for Hughes' 4th aircraft design. In July of 1946, the flying boat left the Culver City plant in pieces and began a 28-mile trek to Terminal Island in Long Beach, California. Engineers assured Hughes the roadbeds could withstand the weight of its heavy sections. Utility crews lifted more than 2,000 power lines so the caravan could pass. Schools recessed for the day, and a crowd of more than 100,000 lined the road for the parade. Criticism of the project mounted after the war ended. The flying boat prototype had exceeded the government's funding allowance. There were many people who were eager to proclaim Howard Hughes' project a failure. Although Hughes promised to pay for the cost overruns out of his own pocket, federal politicians tried to cancel the project. Meanwhile, the Hughes team continued to assemble the flying boat in the Long Beach dry dock. But the government wasn't finished with Hughes. A Senate investigation committee headed by Senator Owen Brewster of Maine probed alleged misappropriation of funds for the Spruce Goose, a name coined by the plane's detractors. The committee further accused Hughes's public relations aide, Johnny Meyer, of lavishly entertaining Colonel Elliott Roosevelt, whose father, FDR, had personally intervened to save the flying boat. The Senate proceedings angered Hughes, who felt unjustly singled out for a practice that was common in the aircraft industry. The committee turned up the heat. The question arose, where was Johnny Meyer?
Will you bring Mr. Mars in at the 2 o'clock session?
No, I don't think I will.
Will you try to bring him in?
Oh, I don't think I'll try. I put the sweat of my life into this thing. I have my reputation rolled up in it. And I have stated several times that if it's a failure, I'll probably leave this country and never come back, and I mean it.
Wishing to vindicate himself, Hughes immediately ordered the flying boat ready for taxi tests upon his return from Washington, D.C. On November the 1st, 1947, Hughes ordered the maiden voyage of the plane out of dry dock. It was towed by tugboat into Long Beach Harbor. The largest seaplane ever built was ready to be tested. It was intended only to be a test of the engines and taxiing capabilities, not a flight test. High winds and choppy seas postponed the first test. The next day, the wind died down as a crowd of expectant observers and newsmen gathered.
On the taxiing deck, Hughes takes a last look as the monster dwarfs everything in its vicinity. There are 100 instruments to check on this panel alone before the test begins. A test that is to startle the aviation world. In the cockpit, Hughes sits at the controls. Incidentally, it takes 26,000 pounds hydraulic pressure to operate these controls.
Hughes was ready. The 8 engines kicked on and the crowd cheered. With Hughes at the controls, the giant flying boat glided smoothly across the 3-mile stretch of harbor. From 35 miles per hour, it cruised to 90 miles an hour during the second taxi test when eager newsmen began filing their stories. But they were too eager. Hughes wasn't finished. Catching the media and the crowd unaware, Hughes lowered the wing flaps and taxied a third time.
And now for Mr. Hughes' surprise. As the enormous craft approaches her 95-mile-an-hour takeoff speed, the pilot lifts her onto the step and holds her there as she races through the choppy sea. And with a final drive of her engines, 200 tons are airborne, 5 months ahead of time. 70 feet off the water, she stays for a mile. $23 million worth of airplane has answered a lot of committee questions. It can fly.
The unexpected flight left the crowd and the world stunned. Hughes' comment to the astonished newsmen, "I like to make surprises."
Howard, did you expect that? Certainly, I like to make surprises. You were surprised or not? Oh, I said I thought I'd make a surprise.
The giant seaplane was never to fly again. At Hughes' insistence, she was kept secluded and flight ready in a specially built climate-controlled hangar. Shrouded in mystery, she remained entombed for 33 years at an annual cost of $1 million. Time caught up with both Hughes and the flying boat. After Hughes passed away in 1976, the hangar's lease expired and plans were made to disassemble the historic seaplane. Summa Corporation, Hughes Holding Company, decided to divide her up, parting her out to the Smithsonian and 8 other museums, and then destroying the rest. The Aero Club of Southern California, along with the Rather Corporation and aviation enthusiasts throughout the nation, stepped in to save her. On October 29, 1980, the flying boat emerged from seclusion and into the international spotlight. The world's largest floating crane, Hermann the German, lifted her onto the dock of the temporary storage area. What was expected to take only a few hours took almost 2 days. In February 1982, a new site was ready. The flying boat was taken by barge down Long Beach Harbor, then gently eased into her new domed home, adjacent to the Queen Mary. In the late 1980s, the Disney Corporation purchased the former holdings of the Rather Corporation. Disney discontinued the dome exhibit after 2 years, leaving the flying boat looking for another home. Once again, the Aero Club took on the task of locating a permanent residence for the flying boat, and after reviewing many proposals, awarded her to Evergreen International Aviation on July the 9th, 1992. Evergreen's plan, as envisioned by Captain Michael King Smith, proposed to not only preserve and protect her, but also to display her as a central exhibit in a living museum. The move to Oregon brought a new set of problems for the flying boat. It would require disassembly, packaging, transportation, and reassembly. A workforce including some of the original flight crew carefully planned and documented the project to ensure a successful journey. Disassembly began August 10, 1992, and concluded 6 weeks later with the plane in 38 separate pieces. Crews created the propellers, engines, and smaller parts, shipping them via Interstate 5. A large opening was created in the dome, and the remaining pieces were shrink-wrapped and rolled out onto an ocean-going barge. After traveling 980 nautical miles from Long Beach, California, the control surfaces, horizontal stabilizers, wings, vertical tail, and fuselage arrived in Portland, Oregon. Thousands of people celebrated the arrival with an official proclamation of Spruce Goose Day, declared by Mayor Bud Clark on October the 22nd at Tomahawk Waterfront Park. The water levels of the Willamette River delayed the flying boat's trip from Portland to McMinnville. The water was either too high for passage under bridges or too low for migration from the river to land. The large pieces remained in storage for several months. Finally, conditions improved and the flying boat slowly made her way upriver, setting new records at historic Willamette Falls for the longest and highest load ever to pass through the locks. After landing near Dayton, the caravan of pieces stretched more than 1,500 feet down the narrow road. The flying boat arrived in McMinnville at Evergreen International Aviation on February 27, 1993. A Spruce Goose homecoming parade converged down the final mile of the 138-day, 1,055-mile trip from Long Beach. Shortly after the successful arrival in McMinnville, tragedy struck when the museum's co-founder, Captain Michael King Smith, died in an automobile accident. His father, Delford M. Smith, founder of Evergreen International Aviation, persevered and continued his son's dream of an educational institute and living museum. The Captain Michael King Smith Educational Institute and Evergreen Aviation Museum were created in honor of Captain Smith's life, dreams, and accomplishments. The project continued as dedicated crews of volunteers restored the flying boat's exterior in a temporary storage area. They replaced the deteriorated fabric on the rudder and elevators and removed the old paint by hand from the fuselage, wings, vertical stabilizer, and floats. The paint removal exposed inspection stamps, signatures of men and women who worked on the original construction, and evidence that the Duramold had passed wind shear tests. The large pieces of the flying boat were sanded, primed with a white latex finish, and repainted in the original silver flight color. Preparation began for the final 800-foot move from temporary storage to the new museum. Moving crews, news crews, and spectators began arriving during the early morning hours of September 16, 2000. At 10 a.m., the B-17 Flying Fortress signaled the beginning of the procession across Highway 18. The vertical tail came first, followed by the right and left wings, each spanning a distance wider than the 5-lane highway. As the tail and wings slowly made their way around the bends toward the new facility, the flying boat's fuselage began the trek, dwarfing the buildings it passed. The fuselage entered the hangar on September the 22nd and was lowered into its 7-foot pit a week later. Reassembly of the wings occurred on November 15, followed by the vertical tail on November 20th. The pylons were assembled on January 25, 2001, and crews attached the 8 Pratt & Whitney R4360 engines to the flying boat on February 23rd. Volunteers applied new fabric to the ailerons and began restoration of the flaps and horizontal stabilizers during the spring. They painted and prepared the propellers, attaching them to the aircraft in early May. This was followed by assembly of the horizontal stabilizers on May 25th, just in time for the new facility's opening on June 6, 2001. After a busy summer, crews began assembling the flying boat's control surfaces. The flaps were assembled September 6, the ailerons on October 9, and the rudder and elevators were attached in early December. On December 7th, the 60th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor, crews assembled the final piece, the tail cone, after a ribbon-cutting ceremony signifying the completion of the flying boat's incredible journey. Now commonly called the Spruce Goose, the Hughes flying boat has endured many hardships to become a popular and important cultural artifact. The flying boat's size and lift capacity have shaped technology and revolutionized modern flight. She is still the largest wooden seaplane ever built, and now rests amongst other historical aircraft at the Evergreen Aviation Museum in McMinnville, Oregon. She tells a story of sacrifice, determination, and technological developments that embody the pioneering spirit of great aviators like Howard Hughes. Her legacy is a story of a nation's desire to protect freedom in a time of great peril, a rise to the challenge by great and common Americans, and a continuing dedication to our nation's dream to fly.
You.